Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this podcast about the national parties in crisis. This is part of our Nation Divides unit on our prelude to the Civil War, basically the 1850s, road to secession. So, to begin with, I'd like to go over a couple of overarching concepts about how the political system in the United States was in crisis. First and foremost, the two major political parties, the Democrats and the Whigs, definitely are weakened by a variety of issues, as we already talked about. The Compromise of 1850, the controversy over the Fugitive Slave Law, the controversy that continues to grow about slavery and about slavery going into the territories. Now, we also see during this period the rise of temporary parties, parties like the Free Soil Party and the Know Nothing Party, two parties which we'll go into a little more detail shortly. And the last thing, we see the rise of the new political party, a new permanent one called the Republicans, the same Republican Party that is nowadays in American politics. So this is given rise during this period also. So we start off with the election of 1852, a presidential election that for the most part was rather uneventful, except for the fact that we have three candidates. Franklin Pierce was a Democratic candidate, replacing being their choice for president in 1852. General Winfield Scott was nominated by the Whig Party, following a tradition of getting war veterans as their face of the party. Millard Fillmore was seen to be not an adequate replacement after his time finishing out the term of Zachary Taylor. And we have a new political party called the Free Soil Party that nominates John Parker Hale. The Free Soil Party was about free soil for American settlers out west, definitely against the extension of slavery into the territories, and Free Soilers believed that land should be opened up to settlement for basically white poor folks to go out there and settle the land, could give them an opportunity out there. They're expansionists. This is at the tail end of this craze of Manifest Destiny, and that's where they went from. Well, as you see, because by the check, Franklin Pierce will win the election of 1852, and would win by a pretty handsome margin in the Electoral College vote. Obviously, the popular vote's a lot closer. John Hale did get about 5 electoral votes and pulled away some votes away from the other candidates, but for the most part, a very nominal, isolated party. But as you see here, the Democrats definitely win this election pretty handily. The Whig Party in 1852 basically get whipped by the Democratic Party. And so if you look at this, and mainly it was because of the handling of the Compromise of 1850. A lot of people were very dissatisfied with the Compromise of 1850, which was a Whig creation led by Henry Clay. But unfortunately, by this time, I think he's dead, and so he leaves that as a legacy going behind. But the question is, so is Pierce the man for the job of presidency? What kind of guy is he? Well, first and foremost, he's a very friendly and sociable character. However, he wanted to please the extremists on both sides over the sectional controversy. So instead of trying to find common ground which both sides can agree, he tried to placate to both sides. Entertaining thoughts of further American expansion into the South, expeditions to Nicaragua, taking of Cuba. That's a whole different story all unto its own. For the most part, he will be a very weak president and for more or less lose control of the political events that would force him out of office after just one term. So the answer is no. Now, the main figure, politically speaking, is this dapper young man, or older man, very short man, about 5 foot tall, by the name of Stephen A. Douglas. Stephen A. Douglas was a senator from Illinois, and he himself was a very ambitious man. He was eyeing the presidency. He was a Democrat, and knowing if he's from Illinois, from a northern state, he knows that he would need Southern support. So he's thinking of a way in which how can he become president? And he comes up with a plan to do so. And Stephen A. Douglas basically upsets the apple cart tremendously, as we shall see, with the introduction of the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. What does this act do? Well, first and foremost, it's a bill to reorganize the Kansas-Nebraska territory, which is up in here. And the idea is that the territory over the 3630 latitude, which was established by the Missouri Compromise, That's the territory we're talking about. It's going to be divided into two parts, the Kansas Territory and the Nebraska Territory. And nothing's going to change in terms of how territories operate, but he introduces the concept of popular sovereignty. It's an idea we've talked about where people vote to determine if they want to have slavery or not in that territory. And more or less, this violates against the Missouri Compromise line. And so the question is, why would Stephen A. Douglas introduce such a cockamamie plan to upset the apple cart, so to speak? Well, first and foremost, he wants the Kansas-Nebraska territory to become a state because he's planning on building a railroad or having a railroad coming from Chicago to California, a more northerly route. And if he's able to do this, it's going to link Chicago to the west. Now, Chicago is a city on the Lake Michigan from his state of Illinois, and in doing so, he would win favor from the north and be good for the city of Chicago. But being wanting to be president, he needs help of these guys down here. He needs Southern support because the Southerners are planning on trying to build a railroad for a more southern line. So, how can Douglas convince the Southerners to do that? Well, he throws out the prize of the Kansas-Nebraska territory as a place they could open up to slavery. And the idea is that Southern Democrats would jump on board with this and help him out. And so, because if he had supported just the northern route, it's going to hurt his chances with the Southern Democrats. It's going to hurt his presidential ambitions. So, he puts the Kansas-Nebraska Act there, supporting popular sovereignty, let the people decide, not Congress, and this will make the South happy. Why? Because now slavery can take hold in the plain regions and so on. So his two main motives are presidential ambition as well as railroad in a territory. And railroads in a territory has to be a state. On top of that, he owns some of the territory. He has land in which the railroad is going to cross through. So this is your classic story of conflict of interest. Well, how do people react to the Kansas-Nebraska Act? Okay. Well, first and foremost, the South tend to be very supportive. It really helps Douglas gain some greater support among Southern delegates. They help out his presidential ambitions. There's talk about nominating him as a Democratic candidate in the near future for president. They, in turn, support his northern railroad route plan, as well as thus repealing the Missouri Compromise. However, the northern reaction tended to be a lot more negative, as seen by the political cartoon right here. If you get a chance, pause it and take a look at it and try to figure out what they're getting at. More or less that slavery is being forced down the throat of free soilers, as it says there in the title. Much more negative reaction. And this is really mainly because an outpouring of people who thought the territories would be banning slavery would be kept in place. And so thus the North starts developing a deeper hatred of slavery into the territory. But the other thing, too, is a question of popular sovereignty. Is it a good idea? And it kind of seems logical as a way of deciding the issue of slavery in the territories. Yet the question is, when do the settlers decide the issue? Do they do this before they create a government? Do they do this after they create a government in the territories? Or do they do it when it becomes a state? Who gets to vote? How do you make sure the vote is legitimate? How do you make sure that people do not stuff the ballots one way or another? And Kansas will be the proving ground of popular sovereignty. And as we'll talk about in class, it would lead to a period known as Bleeding Kansas. And that can give you an idea that violence would soon erupt out of it. So needless to say, the Kansas-Nebraska Act is very, very controversial. Now, by the 1850s, we also see the arrival of new arrivals who moved to the United States, which will lead to new types of political parties. Now, this is not a new thing in the 1850s. It's actually been going on for some time. But by the 1850s, you see a response to new immigrants, particularly Irish and German immigrants. Many Irish immigrants settled in a lot of the free states in the North. They worked in factories. But the thing that angered many nativists, as we'll see, is that they were first and foremost Catholics. They had, these weird priests and nuns and parochial schools that separated them from mainstream American society. But also Irish were coming in, taking away jobs from good old hard-working Americans. And for the most part, this was something that nativist Americans feared, was that the Catholics were taking over America. As for the German immigrants, they've been there for a lot of, there was less hostility to them because many German immigrants were Protestants, yet the German language, that many German immigrants did not give up their language and continue to speak German, was an area of suspicion. And a lot of them kind of kept to their own traditions, their own way of doing things, whether it be in terms of their own culture, their music, their churches, their papers, whatever it is. They don't really climatize to the American way of life or Americanize. So more or less, these two immigrants groups are kind of seen as outsiders. Because of the rise of these groups coming in big numbers in the 1840s into the 1850s, you see the rise of nativism. Okay, nativism is basically an anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant movement, mainly motivated by fear of loss of jobs to immigrants. They don't like Catholics. They tend to be morally Protestants. They're anti-immigrants, and they want to support Native Americans, as they call themselves, Americans born in America. Not Native Americans like the Indians, but Native Americans from the original settlers of the colonies, descendants of English heritage and ancestry. And for the most part, these nativists were not afraid to assert their rights, and very often would do so violently, as the early 2000s movie Gangs of New York illustrates by this picture here, with Mr. Daniel Day-Lewis and Leonardo DiCaprio playing starring roles in it. Good movie to check out to get an idea about how fighting was in the city. In 1949, some of these nativists organized the Secret Order of the Star-Spangled Banner in New York City. This secret organization was very much on an anti-immigrant agenda. And when a political reporter asked one of these members about this Star-Spangled Banner organization, the person responded, "I know nothing." And thus, as the Star-Spangled Banner became a more political and politically active organization, it became known as the Know Nothing Party, otherwise known as the American Party. First and foremost, they wanted to restrict the flow of immigrants to the United States. They also wanted to change the naturalization laws. They wanted people, if you move to the United States, to live in the United States for 21 years before you can become a citizen. Very, very long time, more or less. A lot of times people would die off before they even have a chance to become a citizen. And the last thing is that they would support white, native-born Protestant politicians. And they were not afraid, and very often, to use their muscle, as described by this placard in Kentucky about Bloody Monday, where the Know-Nothings attacked German and Catholic settlers. Now, the last political group that emerges in the 1850s is the modern Republican Party. And there is the birthplace of the modern Republican Party in Wisconsin at this building, the first meeting house. And this would be a coalition of Northern Whigs, anti-slavery Democrats, as well as Free Soilers. And for the most part, they're all united by the fact that they do not like the Kansas-Nebraska Act. They were against this plan of Douglas. They were in opposition to it, and really feel it's time to formulate a new political party. The Whig Party has lost a lot of momentum. As many Democrats disenchanted with the Southern Democrats, so we have this change going on. They also have a new economic vision for the United States, which is kind of a revamped old Whig Party platform of promoting higher wages for factory workers, providing easier access to land for settlers, the building of a transcontinental railroad, and also higher tariffs to protect American industry. Their agenda also was really the part that got them out there was a ban on slavery from the territories and against the expansion of slavery, which is starting to pit them against Democrats who are now trying to make more changes or are forced to make a decision as to which side they support. Well, the Republican Party will make its first bid for the presidency in 1856. Democrats abandoned Franklin Pierce and nominate James Buchanan to be their new presidential candidate. John C. Fremont of the infamous Bear Flag Revolt and Mexican Mexican-American War becomes a Republican candidate. And Millard Fillmore, the former president of the United States, vice president under Zachary Taylor, becomes the presidential candidate of the American Party, the Know Nothing Party. Well, in this election, As you can see here, the electoral vote a little closer than last time. Actually, the Republican Party does pretty well. They do lose about 500,000 popular votes, mainly because it is a newer party and a lot of distrust. But if you notice, 11 of the 16 free states, states that do not have slavery, went Republican in 1856. And many Southern Democrats and Southerners started questioning, well, could the Republicans actually win the White House without any Southern support? Meaning they may not get the popular vote, but they could control the White House just by northern free states voting Republican. Millard Fillmore did make a splash in Maryland, as you see, with 8 votes there, electoral votes, and took about 26%. So that kind of shows that this nativist sentiment was pretty strong amongst the voting population. And so what does this mean in the future? Well, after 1856, obviously we have James Buchanan as president, and I'll ask the same question again as I did with Franklin Pierce before. Is he man for the job? And we're going to see pretty much no, because he really doesn't do anything. As controversies like the Bleeding Kansas emerges, the Dred Scott decision comes out, John Brown, and also secessionists make their mark in 1860 on his watch, James Buchanan often is given the least distinguished honor as the worst president of the United States. And with that, I leave you. Thank you very much, and have a good day.